Hey guys, this is Patrick from STH, and today we have something that we have heard a lot from you in the audience that you really want to see, and that is an AMD Ryzen powered Project TinyMiniMicro node. Specifically, we have the Lenovo M75q-1, which is the first generation of these. And in this video, we're going to go through the hardware of this unit. I'm also going to compare it to a lot of the other units that we have discussed and we've gone over and we've done videos on. We're going to talk about performance, power consumption, and then I'm going to give you my final thoughts, and those are definitely going to be controversial. The reason that these thoughts are going to be controversial is because, number one, I absolutely love this unit. I was just ecstatic even just opening the box. At the same time, I also don't think I'm going to recommend this unit. So yeah, we got a lot to cover. And for those of you that are new to this series, Project TinyMiniMicro is a series where we purchased over 2 dozen, in fact, I think we're getting close to about 3 dozen now, about 1 liter systems that were really designed as corporate desktop PCs. But now we're finding that they actually hit the secondary market because these corporations are buying them in the tens of thousands is like the order quantities. So these things come off of lease or, something happens and then all of a sudden they hit the secondary market in large quantities and they become very inexpensive. Some people purchase them on places like eBay. Some just go to, Craigslist or find them locally and get them for very low dollar amounts compared to what you would get new. And the cool thing about them is that, number one, they tend to be very inexpensive. And two, if you want to have something that you want to go build out like a cluster of nodes, these are very small. They're low power, low cost, usually pretty quiet, and generally available. So that's why they make really good cluster nodes, and they also make really good desktops because they're actually designed as desktops. We already have guides in terms of how to turn these things into Plex servers. We have a guide in terms of turning one of these into a pfSense appliance, and we're going to have more guides in the future on them. And for those of you wondering, how do we even pay for this type of thing? We sell merch. So you can go check out merch like this awesome green hoodie on the STH merch shop, which is in the Teespring link in the description. We get a little bit to cover our costs, but I think also Teespring and YouTube make some money too. And that's just kind of the way it is. Now, before we get into the hardware overview, I want to explain what we purchased and how much we paid, because that's actually a huge portion of this entire discussion is really the price for what we got. We got one of the absolute best nodes and best configured nodes that we have purchased in this entire series. We also paid pretty much about the most that we paid for any unit thus far. This unit, we paid $599 before tax and shipping, new. And what I mean by new is this was actually a unit that had warranty. On-site warranty. We opened the box. We actually, cut the Lenovo seals open. And so this was a brand new unit. So if you see any scuffs, any dirt, anything like that, it is 100% ours. We are showing when we purchase secondhand units and they come with grime, we're showing that grime because I think it's important to remember that, especially if you're buying a secondhand unit, you have to get in there and actually clean it out, which is really important. And so we like showing that on these videos. But this unit came about as well configured as you could possibly want. We had a Ryzen 5 Pro, I think 3400GE, which was like the top of the line 35 watt TDP CPU in this generation. We got 32 gigabytes of memory. We also got Windows 10 Pro and a 512 gigabyte NVMe SSD. We also got Wi-Fi. And one of the other really cool things that you get if you do get the retail box and brand new retail box, not only do we get Wi-Fi and the Wi-Fi antenna, but we also got a keyboard and mouse. And in this particular unit, Lenovo is upgrading and you actually get a wireless keyboard and mouse. And that's just really nice considering all the other ones that we've got, or almost all the other ones we got, are wired units. It's a nice little feature. And the last little feature that we got that, if you do enough of these units, I think you get really excited about these little bits like this. But as you can see, this unit is actually standing up and it's not just on its side. There's actually a little tiny stand that came in the box. And so I said, hey, why don't we use that little stand? Because clearly it's awesome. Now, I know that for $600, a lot of folks are going to say, hey, this is really not really in the spirit of Project TinyMiniMicro. You started out looking at like these like $200-$300 nodes. This is 2-3x that. This seems really expensive. It is, I understand, but you guys have said you wanted to see Ryzen, and so we got a Ryzen unit. And specifically, this is a Ryzen 3000 series unit. This is not the 2000 series units because we have done a couple of those before. And so this is one of the newer generations. Of course, as we're doing this video, there is a new Ryzen 4000 GE series, a Ryzen Pro 4000 GE series. We do have one of those inbound. I just purchased it. It's just not here yet. So we have the second generation of this. That is the newer one that is, I think, much better, but we're going to wait to see when it gets here. Okay, after that pretty lengthy intro, let's get into the hardware. So on the front of the unit, you're going to see a mic, a headset port, which are just kind of pretty standard that you see these audio ports on the front of these systems. And then there are two USB ports. Now there's one type A port, one type C port, and these are both USB 3.1 Gen 1 ports, which means they are 5 gigabit per second ports. We are seeing some of these units with newer Gen 2 10 gigabit per second ports, but this is not one of those units. Moving to the rear of the unit, you'll see that we have a display port and an HDMI port. Now you can actually do dual 4K displays on this, no problem. The one challenge though is that the display port is a 4K 60 port, but the HDMI port is rated as a 4K 30 port. You'll also notice that we have blanks in our optional I/O. You can get these with serial ports, VGA ports, HDMI, display port. There are a whole bunch of different options that you can get in these slots, but we just didn't get anything with ours. As with all the Project TinyMiniMicro nodes, we always tell people, look at this slot because you sometimes get something that's really interesting. Sometimes like this, you get nothing. And sometimes you get something that maybe you just will never use, but it's important just to look so you know if you do get a feature that you want. The USB ports are frankly not as good as I would have wanted to see. We get one USB 3 Gen 1 type A ports. That's another 5 gigabit per second port, meaning that we have 2 in the front, 1 in the back, for 3 total. But then the other 3 USB ports are just USB 2 ports, and that just kind of stinks. A lot of the newer units that we're seeing have a lot more USB connectivity, and so being limited to only 3 USB 3 ports is just kind of a bummer, frankly. On the network side, we get a Realtek RTL8111, which is used not just for the 1 gig networking, but also if you're doing AMD Dash for out-of-band management, you have to use that NIC, I guess, as well. And so it's just something to keep in mind that this has a Realtek NIC, not an Intel NIC. We do know that some folks really prefer the Intel NICs, but this is a Realtek unit. The RTL8111 is really, I guess, broadly adopted. I mean, there's tons of them out there. So this actually has great OS support. But if you do want to do things like make a firewall, it's probably not the NIC that you're going to want. You're also going to see that we have a Wi-Fi antenna. We're going to get to that when we get inside. All right, so opening up the unit, pretty similar to the other Lenovo and frankly, the Dell and HP units that we've reviewed as well. You just kind of you do one screw on the back, you pull open the top, and then the top just pops off like that, and you're inside. Always helps when you have it the right way because of how you want to talk about it, but sometimes you open it the wrong way like that and look like a moron. Anyway, so this up here, this whole section up here is actually the CPU heatsink. Under here, we have the AMD Ryzen 5 Pro 3400GE, which is a 35 watt TDP CPU. I just want to take 1 second and talk a little bit about the specs here because I think they're really important. So this is a 3000 series, but it's not the same as the desktop 3000 series. This is still a Zen Plus 12 nanometer part, not a 7 nanometer part. It also has 4 cores, 8 threads, which is pretty darn good. The Core i5, 8500, 9500T, those are like 6 core, 6 thread parts. So the 4 core, 8 thread part actually works pretty well. You may also see these units with the Athlon 200GE or the 300GE, Pro versions of that. And I think there's like a non-Pro as well. You pretty much, I would say, avoid those. Those are 2 core, 4 thread units. And frankly, these are a newer unit. And for anybody out there that is watching the Project TinyMiniMicro series, I just have to say I wouldn't recommend the 2 core 4 thread in a new unit that you're going to pay new unit pricing or near new unit pricing for. I would frankly just go get something that's a little bit older that has a better processor in it. Now, we've already looked at the Ryzen Pro 2000 GE series, and you can get those in this as well. The Gen 2 version of this system is where we start to see the 4000 series with the 7 nanometer Zen, and that's why I ended up going out and purchasing one of those recently. Another just kind of fun note is that if you pull apart and take out this nice little heatsink the fan shroud and airflow shroud for over the heatsink, you pull that off and you see that this heatsink has diagonal fins, which you just don't really see that much. And also the other thing is that this unit has only the CPU on this top section and the radial fan. It doesn't have memory. If you look at some of the ones that Dell and HP have, you see that those actually have memory up there too, but you don't see memory on this side of the motherboard here. So that basically means that the fan is only really there to cool the CPU and not other components. All right, so this black bracket right here is really kind of nice. It's actually the 2.5-inch SATA, I guess, bay or mounting apparatus. And so what you basically do is you pull down on this little lever right here, and the thing just pops out. The actual unit itself is toolless, so you can throw a drive in here and you don't have to screw it in. I love that. I think it's great that Lenovo is including it in here, and I just really think that all of these units should have it. Not all do, but this one does. The one thing I don't like about this whole configuration is actually this little SATA cable. So Lenovo uses this little SATA ribbon, which has the, I guess, data lanes as well as the power lanes and this tiny little ribbon cable. And the kind of bummer bit is that when you pull this out, and you can kind of see it here, when you pull this out, sometimes you can pull the little SATA cable out as well, and then you have to go stick it back in, and it's not hard to do, but it is kind of a little intricate of a process. So if you have, fat fumbly fingers like I do, it's just a little bit annoying to go do. Those that have watched Project TinyMiniMicro, especially have seen systems of this generation, you'll probably say like, hey, does this have that expansion slot where you can go put something like a GPU or a NIC or something like that? It does not have a little PCIe riser slot or mezzanine slot here, so that's just not available. What you do have is an M.2 slot. So you're going to see that the system, it says it has 2 M.2 slots in the spec. One of those is very specifically for the wireless functionality, and that's what we have here. This is an 802.11 AC Intel unit. There's also Qualcomm and Realtek units available, but this has the Intel version. As always, when shopping for these, make sure that you get, number one, the wireless chipset you want. Number two, that if you do want wireless, you make sure that you get a unit with wireless, because there are units out there that do not have wireless built in. So just look out for that. So at this point, you may be wondering, okay, well, I've just seen the motherboard and I saw where the CPU is and I saw where the Wi-Fi card is, I saw where the SATA bay is, but I didn't necessarily see RAM or where this 512 gig NVMe SSD is. And the answer is very similar to a lot of this generation of Lenovo 1-liter systems, where the Tiny has basically this little bit on the back, which you can just pop open like this. And then you can pull this little bottom part off. And under here, you can see that you get your DIMM slots as well as your NVMe bay. So here we have a nice Western Digital 7030 NVMe SSD. So that's our 512 gig SSD. You can upgrade this, of course, if you want to. And then over here, what you can see is that we have 2 DDR4 SODIMM slots. And in this particular configuration, we actually have 2 16 gig DIMMs, which gives us a total of 32 gigabytes of memory. This is an absolutely awesome system with 4 cores, 8 threads, and 32 gigs of memory with the NVMe SSD all in 1 liter. One other small detail that I really like what Lenovo does with this section of their system is that you get a toolless option for the M.2 NVMe SSD. So you don't have to have a little fumbly screw that you could potentially lose in the middle of the chassis or something like that. You just kind of plop this little blue tab down and you can secure your SSD that way. No tools required. You also notice that the cutout of the system seems very wide for a single M.2 SSD. Some of Lenovo's newer systems have 2 M.2 SSDs here, and in this particular system, we only get 1, and that's just kind of a bummer that we don't get 2 here, but that is what it is. So in terms of performance, the Ryzen 5 3400GE is a little bit faster, and this is the Pro version, is a little bit faster than the Core i5 8500T in most benchmarks. And the reason for that is really just comes down to clock speed. This is a 3.3 gigahertz base and a 4 gigahertz turbo clock speed. So overall, pretty darn good. That's actually 100 base and 200 turbo megahertz over the 2400 GE that we've looked at previously. We're going to talk a little bit more just in terms of my thoughts of this versus Intel versions a little bit later in this video, but I want to talk just real quick about power. The power on this, you use a 65 watt Lenovo power brick. I think that's because you're not necessarily driving as much in terms of USB connectivity. And so maybe an advantage of not having all of the super high power and fast USB ports is the fact that you can still use a 65 watt power brick. Overall power consumption, just if you want to kind of put a range in terms of between like idle and maximum, what we saw, I think at idle we were seeing about 11-ish watts. And then when you got up to our maximum power consumption, I think we were just around 50 watts or so. So it wasn't definitely all the way up to that, that 65 watt figure. Of course, if you have a different configuration, it could vary a little bit, but just keeping low power also means that we get relatively low noise, which is great. Now, I mentioned earlier that this particular unit came with Windows 10 Pro. You can also get options with Windows 10 Home. We always suggest getting Pro if you can. And then the other thing that is important, especially for Project TinyMiniMicro, is the fact that this system actually is certified and can come pre-installed with Ubuntu Linux, which basically means if you want that as an option, you want to run especially Debian Linux as an option, this is going to have out-of-box support for all the components, which makes everything really easy to just install and go. And that's an advantage of having it, I guess, pre-installed with that OS from the factory. Is just the fact that you can get something that works really well with it. Okay, so overall, this package is absolutely great. And it was brand new. You know, even little things that had like this little stand and also just the fact that it had a wireless keyboard and mouse. I absolutely love this system. I thought it was phenomenal when we got it. But in terms of our Project TinyMiniMicro series, we always have key lessons learned. And that's where I want to talk about this compared to, well, not just buying it in a vacuum, but instead what it is compared to a lot of its other contemporaries, peers, and things that you might look at in the Project TinyMiniMicro space. Specifically, if you wanted something like a Core i5-8500T unit, a lot of those these days are selling somewhere between $300 and $325. Now, you don't necessarily get 32 gigs of RAM or a 512 gig SSD in all of those, but if your goal is just to have a whole bunch of nodes because maybe you want to go set up a cluster of some sort and you just want physical nodes, well, I actually think that going and getting those systems secondhand makes a lot more sense. And I just did a check because we purchased this a little while ago. I just looked on eBay and I really couldn't find anything that was, new for $600. It looks like the price on these has basically stayed at best, maybe a stable, maybe you can get this for about $615, a similar configuration. So realistically, this is like a $600 to $615 configuration, which is good, and it's definitely not a bad value. Like, I love this system, don't get me wrong, but at the same time, I think if you just want a lot of nodes, I would probably go get the Core i5-8500T units and maybe not get as much performance per node, but then have the ability to have more nodes in my budget. And that brings us to the Gen 2 model. Now you can get the Ryzen 5 model, which is actually a 6-core 12-thread, 7 nanometer, so it's Zen 2. So if you get the Gen 2 version of this, you get Zen 2. And that, I think those sell for about the same, sometimes even a little bit less if you only get 16 gigabytes of memory rather than a full 32. And frankly, the move from Zen Plus to Zen 2 is a huge one. Not only do you get more cores, but you also, and this is actually a little bit important depending on what kind of applications you're going to run, there are actually some microarchitectural and instruction level changes that happened between Zen Plus and Zen 2. And so you do see some little performance improvements just from that. So overall, you get higher IPC and you get more cores, so the newer one is just much faster. And while this 4-core 8-thread 3400GE model was the highest end unit that we could get in this system, with the new one, the one that we actually purchased is the Ryzen 7 Pro, and that's actually an 8-core 16-thread unit in this same 35-watt TDP envelope. Now, of course, that one was a little bit more, and with only 16 gigabytes of memory, I got that new from Lenovo. I just ordered it for, I think it was like $735 or so. So basically for $100, maybe $135 more than this system is selling for, you can get something with twice as many cores, but half as much RAM. And you can always upgrade that RAM. That's super easy to go do. And so probably by the time you will be done, you're talking about an $800 system that has twice as many cores as this one and twice as many threads as this one, also has a microarchitecture bump. I mean, just frankly, to me, if you want a higher end, higher performance system, I think it just makes sense to go and get the new Ryzen one. Now, that one hasn't arrived yet, but I kind of know the answer to this already. We're just kind of getting the system to confirm and be able to show you. And if you're sitting there in the audience and you're thinking to yourself, wait a sec, you just reviewed a Ryzen system and you said, well, you wouldn't get it. Just remember, that's almost completely based on price. If this thing was the same price as a lot of the Core i5, 8500, 9500 systems that we see in the market, I would say this is definitely an awesome option that I would definitely look at. But if it costs, somewhere between $50 more, 100% more than those options, I might just go get the lower end units that are Intel units because they're less expensive and just have more. That is a personal preference thing, but I think if you want to go higher performance in a single node that's in this form factor, you'd end up getting the Gen 2 version of this and just get the newer 7 nanometer parts. Overall, I think this is a supply and demand thing. I think so many people are just maybe excited about the fact that Ryzen's back in the space, or maybe even it's just the fact that Lenovo or other vendors just haven't sold as many AMD units because corporate buyers had been used to purchasing Intel for so long that maybe the volumes of these things aren't as high, and therefore the secondhand market isn't as well developed as you see on the Intel side. But I still think that this is a very nice unit. It's just that the price performance I think is just not there. So overall, good unit and new. I think it has a lot to offer, but on a Project TinyMiniMicro and what we're doing this project on, I don't necessarily think it's the best value. I know I'm going to get a lot of really bad comments for saying anything against AMD. Believe me, I really like AMD products. If you go to the STH main site, you're definitely using at some part of that site is definitely served by an AMD EPYC, either Naples or Rome series processor. I can guarantee you that. So we definitely use AMD a lot. It's just the fact that this is simply comes down to the numbers of what you're getting for how much you're paying. Hey guys, I hope you like this video, and I know you're probably excited to see the next generation Gen 2 of this, and we'll have a video as soon as we can on that unit. It just hasn't arrived yet. I have no idea why. As always, if you have made it this far and you want to keep watching and you want to support us, give us a like, click subscribe, turn on notifications so you can see whenever we come out with great new videos. As always, thanks for watching and have an awesome day.